Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another of our TFA webinar series. This one you will see is entitled DEFRA Future Farm Policy Update and What It Means for You. And we're very pleased to be joined by Janet Hughes, who's the Programme Director of Future Farming and Countryside Programme at DEFRA this evening. And I'll introduce Janet a little bit later, just when we've got going. Just a few things ahead of getting underway. First of all, just to remind you all, or those of you that haven't joined before, that our webinars are recorded and edited and available on our TFA YouTube channel, as well as within the news section of the TFA website, tfa.org.uk. So you can share and watch back on demand, and all of the previous webinars are also there. So if you have missed any or you want to catch up on anything, then head over to the website or the YouTube channel. Obviously, in terms of Q&A, we're going to try and leave plenty of time for Q&A tonight. I anticipate quite a number of questions. We've had some questions pre-submitted from members, which we will endeavour to ask. Just for those, again, those of you who maybe aren't familiar with Zoom, if you can use the chat function to put your Q&A area at the bottom of your screen, we will try and pick those questions up. As before, we may well not get to answering all of the questions. Those if we don't, Janet has been kind enough to commit to coming back and answering those questions for us after the sessions, and again we'll put the answers on the website of those. So apologies in advance if your question doesn't get asked, but we will do our level best to fit them in and try and cover as many of the areas as we can. So just ahead of introducing the speakers, I thought it might be worth just giving maybe 2 or 3 minutes to where we are as an organisation and where we see future farm policy going at the moment. I guess none of you need reminding that the change that's sort of coming down the track in terms of agricultural support is a sort of once in a generation. I guess the last time this happened was when we joined the EU. So for many of us, you know, we probably weren't farming at that time. So it's a real step change. I think what it does raise is a real opportunity and a real possibility for real change within the sector. I think BPS is one of those systems that has the beauty of simplicity, but it's a sledgehammer to crush a nut in lots of ways. So the disappearance of BPS in some ways is not an issue. However, I think it's really important that we can all understand how we can continue to get support from the new schemes that are coming down the line. And I guess where we are today, we would say we are a little bit frustrated with the progress to date. It's just over 5 years since we left since we had the vote to leave the EU, which obviously meant we were going to remove ourselves from CAP. And yet we seem to have perhaps too little detail other than a general direction of travel. Now, that may be a bit harsh, and I'm sure Janet will correct me on that as she goes through this evening. But it does feel a little bit like the train is coming down the track quite quickly at us. We know how quickly BPS is going to disappear, but we don't really know enough detail, I think, as to how we might get supported in the future, and certainly how we might access the funding. And as an organisation, we have been lobbying very hard and are still yet to see some of the detail about how tenants can access this funding. And we will definitely keep pushing on that, I think. BPS, as you know, it's an annual scheme, everybody open to everybody, above 5 hectares and so on, and relatively simple to apply for, I think. Some of you may disagree with that, but relatively simple to apply for. I think where we are now is what appears to be inevitably a more complex scheme, but it's not clear how tenants might be able to access that, particularly the longer term schemes. So I think it's really important as this change comes ahead that the tenanted sector is absolutely not forgotten. It's a really important part, and many of you tonight, obviously on the call, will echo my thoughts on that. So anyway, without further ado, I think I'd like to pass over to Janet. Sorry, excuse me. Just worth a brief introduction. Janet's been the Programme Director for DEFRA's Future Farming and Countryside Programme since June 2020. She heads up the team that's responsible for transforming the way we support and regulate farming in the countryside in England. And over the next 7 years, the programme will be, as we know, closing down existing schemes and replacing them with environment, land management, grant support, innovation, R&D support, and a new approach to regulation and enforcement. So, and I'm sure Janet will be able to give a lot more detail as to how her role goes and where we are with that. And before I just ask Janet to come in, obviously we're also joined tonight by Lynette Steele, who many of you will know is our Farm Policy Advisor. Lynette joined the TFA as the Farm Policy Advisor in 2018. She has obviously a lot of practical knowledge farming alongside her husband on a tenanted arable holding in Hampshire, where she plays an important and integral part in running the business. So a foot in both camps, Lynette, I think, on this one. So you'll be able to grill Janet as we go through the evening, along with many of the others. Anyway, without further ado, Janet, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll pass over to you to get things underway.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks everyone for taking the time to dial in this morning when I'm sure you've got very busy lives, so I really hope I can make your time worthwhile. And as Mark says, if you don't get a chance to ask me a question this evening, or you're a bit shy, or you want to follow up in some other way, you are more than welcome to email me afterwards. I've just put my email in the chat. And if Twitter is your thing, I'm very active on Twitter and I try to reply to all of the questions that I get. I'm pretty sure I reply to all of them. So you can find me at Janet Hughes on Twitter as well. I'm pretty easy to find. So if you don't get a chance to talk this evening, then track me down and I'm all ears. I want to hear what you've got to say. I'm here to answer your questions. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the things that I'm responsible for and that me and my colleagues are working on, just so you know what the scope is of things that I can help you with this evening. What we're doing in the programme that I lead is we're doing everything that is involved in coming out of the Common Agricultural Policy and putting in place replacement arrangements in England. And you will know, as Mark mentioned, that part of that is about phasing out direct payments, where we spend £1.8 billion a year currently on direct payments, and over the next 7 years we'll be phasing that down to zero. But we will be spending the same amount of money and using that money instead to reward farmers for the public goods that they produce on their land. And many farmers already produce public goods on their land, and we would like them to do more. And we would like more farmers to be producing public goods alongside their food, because what we're here to do is achieve two sets of objectives here. One is to have a vibrant, prosperous, competitive, productive sector producing healthy, nutritious food for our nation, as you all do so passionately and so well. And also at the same time, thinking about the production of environmental goods, of climate goods, and of animal welfare goods. So biodiversity, water quality, air quality, flood risk mitigation, and carbon sequestration. We want to reward the production of those goods alongside food in farming. And so we're going to do that by, first of all, improving and simplifying our existing schemes, countryside stewardship in particular, to make them simpler, more attractive, and fairer in the way that we administer them for farmers, so that people can feel like it's a less risky thing to get involved. And in making those improvements, we'll learn things which we will apply in our new schemes. And we're going to be introducing 3 new schemes. One of them is the Sustainable Farming Incentive. That's for actions that can be taken on any farm anywhere and are good for either the environment or climate or animal welfare. And we've already released some of the details about what will be in that scheme in 2022. And we can get into that in the discussion if you would like, but we're basically starting with soils. So we're going to be paying for farmers on arable and horticultural land, on non-improved grassland, to take care of their soils by doing things like preventing runoff, growing cover crops, minimising tillage. And the Sustainable Farming Incentive will have 3 levels of ambition. So you can come in at one of 3 levels of ambition for those standards, and you'll get paid depending on what the level of ambition is that you pursue on your farm. And the idea is there's something in there for everybody. It should be really straightforward for you to apply and take part in, and it should be really attractive to everybody, including, very importantly, tenants. And so in our pilot that we've recently launched, we've been doing a lot of work to understand what do we need to do to make this scheme both make sure tenants are eligible for the scheme in the first place, but also make it attractive and workable for tenants. And we can get into some of that in the Q&A too. So that's the Sustainable Farming Incentive. That's the farm level actions that farmers can take on their land to improve the environment, climate, or animal welfare. The second scheme is the local nature recovery scheme, and that scheme is about paying for the right thing in the right place. So on top of what you're doing through the sustainable farming incentive, say to look after your soils or your hedgerows, you might also take part in locally defined priorities. So you might be in an area where nitrate runoff is a real priority, or phosphate runoff, or biodiversity, or some other flood risk, and you will collaborate locally to set some priorities, and then we'll pay you to do things that are appropriate to your particular area. So that's the local nature recovery scheme. And the timing for that one, so sustainable farming incentive will start to roll that out from next year, the first few elements, and then we'll gradually scale it up until 2024, when it'll become the main way for you to get paid for public goods on your land. And the local nature recovery scheme, we're piloting some aspects of that now. We'll be doing some more piloting over the next year, and then we'll start a gradual rollout of that from 2023. And then by 2024, 25, that will also be fully up and running. And by that time, you will no longer go into new countryside stewardship agreements. If you want to go into an agreement to produce public goods, you'll be coming in through either sustainable farming or local nature recovery, or the third scheme, which is for landscape scale change. So that's much more about much longer term habitat restoration, land use change, for example, woodland creation or rewilding, or other land, peatland restoration, wetland restoration. And that one is going to be much more about bespoke projects agreed between government and either an estate or a collaboration between a number of different parties on a larger area of land over a much longer period of time. And we'll do the first projects in landscape recovery over the next year, and we'll have 10 in place by 2024, and then we'll scale up from there. So you've got your farm level actions through sustainable farming incentive, you've got locally targeted actions through local nature recovery, and then you've got landscape scale change through the landscape recovery scheme. And all three of those will be fully live from 2024-25, but we are gradually rolling them out in an incremental way. And the reason we're doing that is because we have learned from the past, both in DEFRA and other parts of government, that if you just press a big button one day and try to crank a handle from the old to the new, it can very often go wrong. And that's the last thing that we want to see happen. So those are the environment schemes. We're also doing other things alongside those that don't get quite as much attention though, one of which is to improve the way regulation and enforcement of the rules to prevent damage in the countryside work. And we know that those rules are currently broadly seen as not very fair, very punitive, very harsh when you haven't really done much damage, and not very effective when you have actually willfully done some damage. And so we need to flip that round. We need to make it so that there is a real proper, real and present risk of being caught and it being bad news if you willfully destroy the environment by discharging slurry all over the river, for example. But if you happen to make a mistake on a form, we don't come down on you like a ton of bricks. So we're doing some work on regulation and enforcement with a view to replacing the cross-compliance regime in 2024 with a new, fairer, more proportionate and more effective set of ways to prevent damage in the countryside. And then the third area that we're working on, so we've got the environment schemes, we've got regulation and enforcement, and then the third area is productivity support and prosperity support. And like I said, we're pursuing two aims all the time in this programme. One is about having a prosperous, competitive sector producing healthy food, and the other at the same time is this environment, climate and welfare set of outcomes. And we believe you can't have one of those sets of outcomes without the other in the long term, because you can't be producing environmental goods if you're not actually a viable business, and you can't be a viable business in the long term unless we look after our environment on which we rely for these businesses. So we will also be supporting productivity in the sector and investing in productivity in the sector through a number of different ways. So we'll be providing grants to help farmers to invest in the kits and equipment and technology and practices that you need to use in order to become more efficient over time. And that happens also to often have benefits for the environment and climate by reducing inputs, for example, or reducing carbon. But we'll also be supporting innovation, research and development in the sector. So we want more research, more development, and also much more rapid adoption of innovative techniques and technology. And we'll be investing across a range of different schemes to try to make that happen too. So you've got the direct payment reductions, you've got the money from those reductions going into environment schemes and also to a lesser extent into productivity schemes. And you've got the improvements to regulation and enforcement. And when we do all of those things together, by the end of this transition, we will have a sector that's no longer reliant on subsidies, but instead is prosperous, competitive, resilient, and also producing environmental goods. I mentioned about the importance of making sure that sustainable farming incentive works for tenants. It's important we make sure everything we're doing works for tenants, and that's about making clear what's available to you, making sure that you're eligible to take part in the schemes, and that you're not ruled out by some rule that we've put in that we didn't even notice was going to rule you out by accident. And the Tenant Farmers Association are really good at holding our feet to the fire on this and making sure we don't do that, and we're really grateful for that engagement. We also need to make it attractive for you to participate. These are business decisions, and we do absolutely recognise that fact. And what we're trying to do is make business sense for you to think about production in a broader sense than you might do today. So you think about your food production, and you also think about environmental production alongside that as part of your business. So we want to make it attractive for you and make business sense for you to participate in these schemes. And we also just need to make it workable for you. So obviously there are issues around the relationship between landlord and tenant, who gets paid for public goods, what's the length of agreements, what are the conditions for entry and exit from agreements, and penalties for exit. And we can get into all of those questions as we're discussing this evening. But again, it's really important to us that we continue engaging with you throughout this process, because we won't get everything right first time. This is a very complex, large-scale set of reforms. What we need to be able to do is keep up engagement and co-design throughout the whole process, so we can keep making things better, keep improving, keep correcting our course, so that by the time we get to the end of this 7-year period, I'll come back and see you again, and you can tell me how brilliant things are and how surprised you are that we've managed to actually pull this off. And I don't say that lightly, by the way, because I recognise, if I were in your position, I'd be extremely skeptical about some woman turning up from DEFRA telling me everything is going to be brilliant, knowing what you know, which is how we've failed to do that in the past. So we take that really seriously. We respect the fact that we need to build trust in the community, and we need to earn your trust by delivering what I've just set out in a way that works for you. And part of why I'm here this evening is to hear what you've got to say about how we can best do that for you. And then let's keep the conversation going on after today too. So with that, I think I will just hand back to you, Mark. I'm going to post a couple of links in the chat by way of retaliation to your allegation about lack of detail, by the way. And for anyone who hasn't seen them, I'm going to post some links to some documents that we published, which do set out some detail about what we're going to be doing. One of the links is our blog, which is where we publish regular updates about what we're doing in the program, and you can sign up to get an email anytime we publish something new, or we announce something new, or there's an opportunity to get involved. And we also published our whole plan, so you can read that and see how everything fits together. We published that last November. And then the final thing is the update that we just published in June, which sets out what's going to be available in the Sustainable Farming Incentive from 2022, which is the first time that will be available at scale for everyone. So I do, in your own time, or if you get bored of me talking at some point this evening, you can just flick through some of those on your screen at the same time. All right, thanks, Mark. Look forward to the questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jana, and thanks for those links as well. I would encourage people to have a look at the blog, actually, if you're that way minded. It is quite useful and has some useful information in it. So I'm not apologising for criticising the lack of detail, Jana, but that is useful for sure. So
excellent. Well, I'll take that.
I will also just apologise to everybody, and Julia in particular, because I think I mentioned earlier to please put your question in the chat function. What I really meant to say was please put it in the Q&A function. So anyway, we're just making George's job a lot more difficult in trying to juggle what questions are in the chat and what questions are in the Q&A, but I'm sure he's up to the task. So we will try and catch those questions. So apologies to Julia in particular for misleading everybody. So, but thanks for the questions. So I think without further ado, we'll just get cracking with the questions. There's quite a few coming through. There's some that have been sent in earlier, and I'd probably end up just jumping around a little bit, Janet, because some of these are kind of not connected, and there's a lot of stuff in.
That's fine.
I'm just going to start with one from Helen Radmore, well, actually two from Helen, which are slightly connected, I think, who farms up on Dartmoor and does a sterling job for us in terms of representing sort of uplands in terms of this whole debate. And she's raised two questions which I think are connected. The first one is, why has DEFRA again failed to develop a bespoke scheme for commons, continuing saying that you're learning from the past, but it doesn't seem to apply to commons? And I think that is a real concern, and it's been raised on a lot of occasion. And I think slightly connected to this in the way in which perhaps a broader question for the uplands generally. Helen also asked, in view of Liverpool being stripped of its World Heritage status, will the Lake District be next? She says, the Lake District attains its status under cultural landscape, in particular the pattern of family farm tenure, hefted grazing system which allows communal shepherding without fences and walls on the largest area of common grazing in Europe. And she's concerned that DEFRA's poor understanding in the value of traditional communal grazing and tenancies that operate in this cultural system are being dismantled by the way uplands and the commons are being dealt with. So that's quite a lot in there, Jan. I appreciate that, but I think it's a big issue for quite a number of our members. So.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thanks, Helen. So the first thing is we haven't failed yet, and we don't intend to fail to make our schemes work for the commons. So I'll run through some of the things that we've done so far to make sure that that happens. We're not just sort of sitting on our hands. We're running a whole program of what we call tests and trials, which are live things on the ground in real life run by farmers and others to test out different elements of our new schemes. And some of those are looking at how should the new schemes work on commons. So those are actual commoners working with us to look at what the future should look like. And people who do common farming are way more experts than I in what that should look like. And that's why farmer-led tests and trials are so important. So we are learning from those tests and trials and we're feeding it into the design of the new schemes. We're also going to be testing through the pilot. We've got a three-year period during which we're running pilots alongside our gradual rollout of the schemes, and we will be testing in that what's the best way to facilitate and enable commoners to take part in the schemes that we've got on offer. And we're trying to make sure that we are trying to make sure that what we do works. Having said all of that, as you will know, it is extremely complicated, and if we rush headlong into some kind of solution in order to show that we care and mess it up, that's a much worse outcome than taking our time to test these things and to engage in depth with the sector to understand what we need to do. And so that's what we're doing. So we have various engagement groups that we work with in the programme also to understand how does this need to work for those on common land. We have some of the country's leading experts taking part in frequent and in-depth engagement with us. Sometimes we don't get it right. And when we notice we've done that, we correct our course. So we had a standard that we were working on for sustainable farming incentive for moorlands. And we got feedback from farmers that where we were at with it was not going to work for them on common land in moorland areas, and therefore we decided to just to not go forward with it for now and instead spend more time working on it together because we want to get it right. So instead what we're doing for the moorlands next year is we're going to be paying farmers in moorland areas to do an assessment of the condition of the moorlands as the basis for future action, and that seems to be being received much better among our stakeholders. So I wouldn't like you to think for a second that we have forgotten about the commons or the uplands for that matter, or that we're not working on it. We are working really hard on it. Do we know what all of the answers are at this point in time? No, we don't, because it's very complicated and we need to go carefully and a bit at a time. And I recognise that's frustrating because you'd like me to be able to tell you the full answer and because you want to know and have clarity, and we do also really respect that. But I think on balance, we have to take our time to get this right. And if you'd like to get involved, if you're not involved, Helen, and you'd like to get involved and you'd like to talk to the team a bit further about what we're doing on this, then please do use my email address and get in touch, and we'd be delighted to have you involved in helping test our schemes and make them better. And in terms of the uplands, I think, what can I say about this? I think we do recognise the special nature of the uplands and the community heritage value, and also the community value, the heritage value, and also the environmental value of that land. And what we're trying to do is create a space for everybody in our future schemes. And we actually think that those in upland farm situations are more likely to take more advantage of environment schemes because there's going to be more in there for them. And you do tend to see a higher proportion of farms above the moorland line taking part in schemes. In general, there's 75% already taking part in schemes. So we think there's plenty of opportunity in there for farmers to continue producing food, continue to operate in the way that they are with the hefting systems and all of the others that you've mentioned, and also produce more public goods for the environment. And I've visited a few farms now in the uplands area. I haven't had as many visits as I would like over the next year for obvious reasons, but last summer I was out and about every week, and now I'm back out and about every week on farms. And I've seen in action how farms can maintain their cultural heritage and their traditional practices and also produce public goods on their land at the same time. So it is definitely possible if we can design the schemes right, and we are fully committed to doing that.
Thanks, Janet. Lynette, do you want to add anything on uplands and commons from our perspective on the points that Helen's raised?
I think I'd just pick up on one of those points that Janet made about public access on common land and how that really fits in with tenanted holdings. That's something that really needs to be considered by DEFRA and fully understood, and we are engaged, and Helen does a fantastic job representing the TFA in the upland forums, and is fully engaged in that programme. But this is where I think from the TFA point of view, we're getting down to this nitty-gritty detail of making these sweeping statements is great, and it's the way to go, obviously, and how the payments are coming, but how that's actually going to work on tenanted holdings, it is the work that we've got to do with DEFRA, and to help them understand how tenants are going to access the scheme and the funding. And as I say, Helen does an absolutely outstanding job for us on those upland forums. So more of a comment, Mark, rather than anything else.
Thanks, Lynette. Yeah, and I think, Janet, and I think where this comes from a bit, and I'll be completely honest here, my knowledge of common land could be written on the back of a postage stamp, and not quite the same with uplands, although farming slightly below sea level. I'm not really familiar with uplands in that way, but I think what I do hear, and I hear from a lot of members, and I certainly hear from Helen, and have done for a lot of years, is that commons in particular has been a very difficult nut to crack, even under BPS. So guys, people that are farming in these areas have had, I think, years and years of frustration and years of pointing out to DEFRA why they have these frustrations. And now we're in a phase where, you know, the BPS is actually, it's underway now. We are losing the BPS, and you know, in a couple of years' time, we've lost 50% of it. Actually, the clock is really ticking on this, and I really do feel for these for people farming up in those areas, because this isn't a frustration that maybe the likes of others of us are frustrated by the speed of SFI, for example. This has been going on for, it seems like donkey's years, really, and there has to be a solution to it if this is still going to be a method of farming. So I think it's really important that that's taken on board. Yeah. You mentioned, just moving on, Janet, you mentioned tests and trials briefly, and there's a question. So I will continue to jump around here. So you mentioned tests and trials. There's a question from Christopher Renner, who's a member in the East Midlands, who's saying, with the current phase of tests and trials not really having yet started, how can the results from the test and trial scheme really make a difference and feed into Elms ahead of its launch in 2024, given that that's sort of just three years away? And on what time scale do you really expect to get meaningful results from the test and trials? And perhaps we could add the pilot into that as well, really. I don't know if you want to just pick up on that one.
Yeah, so there's a sort of, the way government used to do things like this was it would do a pilot for multiple years, and then after it would stop and have a think for maybe a year or two, and then it would launch a full scheme. That's great if you've got years and years and years, but it's actually not a very effective way of operating, because you can actually learn a lot more quickly than that and apply it in real life a lot more quickly than that. We don't need to wait to do a pilot to start making improvements, which we've already actually started doing in existing schemes. So we want to be much more action oriented and much more able to respond to learning as we go. And so the way we see these is we have been running the tests and trials for at least a year now. It must be more than that, because they'd already been running when I joined the programme, and we've got 70 that are already underway, many of which have already started, either concluded or reaching their conclusion, and are reporting what they've found. And as we go, we don't wait till they've finished either to learn from them. We talk to the people who are running those tests and trials regularly. We collect learning from them every month and we synthesize it and we think, what should we do with this then? And what does that mean about our scheme design? And then we play that into the scheme design. And as we start rolling out the new schemes, the tests and trials will run alongside them, and they'll be like a research and development wing of the organization. So we'll have the main scheme, which will have in it the things that we've already tried and tested and we're already confident in. And then we'll have tests and trials, and the pilot for that matter, running alongside, testing out new things until the point when we're confident, and then we'll add them into the main service. So they'll be running in parallel. We'll be learning all the time and feeding that into the main scheme, and then occasionally dropping releasing new features into the new scheme as and when we become confident in them. So it's not sequential. Do the trial, do the pilot, then do the full scheme launch and learn absolutely everything before you move on to the next stage. It's much more of an iterative, incremental process. And that allows us to make small adjustments as we go along and learn from each one about what works. And you can learn in a kind of much more incremental way. And that's been demonstrated both in the private sector and in government to be a way more effective way of learning and feeding into service design than doing this kind of thing that takes ages and isn't actually particularly effective. And so we do expect to get meaningful results. We've already had a lot of meaningful results. Just for an example, some of our tests and trials have been looking at the role of land management plans and how they might support people deciding what to do on their farms, what schemes to participate in, whether they're government or other schemes actually run by private providers like water companies. And we've got over 10, I think it's 13 different templates now that have come out of those tests and trials for how those land management plans might work and how they might be applied. So we're now going to take some of those into the pilot, test it in real life end to end, and then out of that will come our way of doing land management plans, and then we'll feed it into the main scheme. So that's the kind of cycle of ideas that we see flowing through this. So don't worry, we are fully going to be learning, and we're going to be doing that all the way through, not doing a bit of learning at the beginning and then launching. Learning will be built into the way that we do this. And then it'll become a self-improving service forever is the idea, because there's always those tests and trials and learning going on. There's always improvement going on, rather than do a design period and then implement the thing come what may, which is what we've done in the past.
So that's actually really good, really good to hear, Janet, on that, and I guess does make some sense in terms of how you're trying to do it. And I think one of the opportunities we clearly do have, and I do see coming through from much of what we hear from you, is the ability to be, I hate this expression really, but fleet of foot, and have some flexibility with how schemes develop. Yeah. Obviously, the downside of that is it makes it overcomplicated. The upside of it is that if we you really are seeing something not really working, being able to change it and allow a different level of payment or something to come in is I think quite exciting. It's perhaps a bit scary, as well, but if it can be managed well, that's really good to hear. And I have to say, as an organisation, we have been big supporters of land management plans, and it's really good to hear that I don't think I've heard them mentioned in a meeting for a little while. I don't know if Lynette can correct me on that, but so it's really good to hear you talking of those tonight.
Yeah, they're very much still in the frame.
We are quite big supporters of that. Just sticking. Sorry, Lynette, did you want to come in there about tests and trials at all, or are you?
No, obviously, I was just going to reiterate what you said, Mark, about the land management plans. That only those results came out last week or so from a test and trial in Shropshire, I think it was actually. So that's really great to see that we've got that research there now to promote the land management plan. But also, Janet, I think the other thing we've learned from the tests and trials results that we've seen is that early engagement and communication has been absolutely key in ensuring the success of these plans. Which I suppose really gives us the backing and what we've said over the years, Mark, that communication is absolutely key, and sessions like this with members is really going to be the way that things go forward, and to help DEFRA achieve the uptake that they're aiming for, which I believe is over 70% of uptake of environmental schemes on farms. So that's just nice to see that what we've been banging on about actually is coming through in the results.
We don't bang on, Lynette. We just politely ask that something should happen, I'm sure.
Okay.
I would never call it banging on. I think you input constructively and you keep hold our feet to the fire, and that's exactly what should happen. Like, the way I see this is, it's not me and my team and then everyone else. We have to operate as one big team to make this work. And that might sound corny to you, but I don't think we can succeed unless we operate as one big team in the sector to make this work. And that requires everyone to engage in a kind of constructive way to try and help make this work. Point out where we do things wrong. Please do that. And please, like, give us the benefit of the doubt and let us fix it, and we will. And then over time, we'll earn your trust and we'll get to a much better position, won't we?
That's much more eloquently put than me, Janet.
Not at all.
Just a quick one, Janet, on this, if you could answer this reasonably quickly, but it ties into just a little bit what you talked about. Kate Rock asks, how many tenant farmers do you have who have expressed an interest in the pilot? And are you asking for different feedback from them, or providing a sort of a different template for them? I mean, this is something I think we asked of you as an organisation earlier, but it'd be interesting just to quickly hear your answer on that.
You did. So the quick answer is we don't absolutely know, because we only know in about half of the pilot applicant cases whether they are tenant or landowner, because they declared or didn't declare in some other part of data which we thought we could rely on, and it turned out wasn't full. So based on that data, we had just over, I think, 100 out of the 1,000 that declared. We had just over 100 tenants and about 800 owner occupiers. But we're obviously now, those are people who expressed an interest. We had 1,000 who didn't declare, so we don't know how many of those were tenants, but we have at least got some. We're expecting to get a decent chunk of tenants in the actual pilot applying. Part of the reason for that is because we've set it up deliberately to make it attractive and workable for tenants. So scheme agreement length, whether you have to get permission from your landlord, you don't, in order to participate in the pilot, and other such kind of details like that, just to make sure it's workable. So we'll see how many actually participate. But it's also important to say we have got tenants, as Lynette just mentioned, taking part in tests and trials as well. And we also are working with farmers through various engagement groups, and tenant farmers are represented there too. Tenant farmers are part of our top 6 group of membership organisations and senior stakeholders that we regularly interact with. So there's plenty of representation of your views coming into the programme. But having said that, we can always welcome more. So if you want to get involved, drop me an email and I'll introduce you to our engagement team, and they can let you know how you can get involved in helping shape their future.
Oops, thanks, Janet. Just moving on a little bit, I want to leave a bit of time at the end to, well, not at the end, but in maybe the last 15 minutes to cover kind of funding. We've got a lot of questions around funding and income levels and so on, and I'll just try and pool all those together. Janet, if you could do that, but there's a few others around specifics. So James Hadwin asks, based on the retirement scheme, lump sum exit scheme, I think is what it's called, is what measures are in place to ensure that farms are not taken back in hand by landlords to, for example, plant woodland on productive land, thus removing land from the tenanted sector? So the woodland obviously is an example, but what measures do you think are in place on that? Because that's a very...
So I think, let me think about this. So the exit scheme, for those who are not familiar with it, is to enable those who want to leave the sector to do so by giving them access to a capital sum alongside any other capital that they might be able to realise in order to exit. And we think that's really important for those who are in the position, like a farmer I spoke to who had a long-term tenancy and no one to hand it on to, but couldn't afford to leave. And he was really looking forward to the exit scheme. And that's who that's for. It's for people in that sort of situation. It will free up land. We're going to be running new entrant support to help new entrants to take advantage of that opportunity. It's also possible that landlords might take land back in hand. As to whether landlords would then decide to convert it to woodland on productive land, I think that's quite unlikely, because it's a business decision, and that in general, if it's really productive land, that's not likely to be the most profitable thing to do. We don't have specific measures in to stop farmers from doing that. But in terms of what we pay for, that's why the local nature recovery scheme is so important, because what we want to do through that is target the right actions in the right places. So when we're looking at land use change or significant kind of investment in something like woodland creation, we want to make sure that happens in the right places and not just any old where in a random way. So there's some sort of control around that in the form of setting local priorities through local nature recovery and agreeing the contracts through landscape recovery, which would be the way that people would get paid to create that woodland. But are we going to control the decisions that everybody makes in this situation? We can't hope to do that, either on the part of tenants or landowners, and so I wouldn't like to pretend that we would. But do we have policies in place to try to get things to move in broadly the direction we want to see? Then I think yes, we do, in the way that I've just described.
Thanks, Janet. Lynette, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on while we're on the retirement or the exit lump sum exit scheme. I think the words are all the way around at the moment, just as to what we've had interest tenant, member wise, or any comment on that.
As I'm sure everybody can appreciate, I've had a huge amount of members calling regarding the lump sum exit scheme, and as I'm sure as Janet can appreciate, it's something of great interest to our members. The only thing I would just say to members is we are in the consultation phase at the moment, and that doesn't end until the 11th of August. DEFRA will then take a 12-week window to respond to the consultation. So that beautifully aligns with DEFRA's November announcement. So we're not expecting to hear the full terms of the scheme until November. I just highlight this because I think there's been a lot of confusion in the farming press and in the wider press, actually, when the consultation was launched, that this scheme was all set up and it was ready to go. And I've certainly had members contact me saying they're having a lot of pressure from landlords and landlords agents regarding them taking part in the scheme. So I suppose I just really wanted to reiterate that at the moment, we are in a consultation phase and we won't have full scheme details until November. So if anybody is getting any pressure from landlords or agents or has any questions, please just contact me and I can talk through it with you in fuller detail, really.
Can I just mention one other thing about that as well, if I may, Mark? So I've just put the link to the consultation in the chat bar. So just follow that link and there's a blog post that explains it and takes you to where you need to go. I really encourage you to respond to that because we need to know what you think and what's important to you. We've already been getting lots of feedback from tenants about things like the notice period that you would need in order to be able to quit. Sometimes it's a year and it takes 6 months to negotiate the exit. So we need to allow time for you to do that. But if there are other concerns, please, it doesn't take very long. It's quite straightforward, unusually. I know for government, so you should be able to complete it quite quickly. So please do follow that link and tell us what you think about that scheme and how you think we can shape it so it works for you.
Yeah, and I would reiterate that I think one thing that sounds terrible. One thing that DEFRA are quite good at doing is giving access to people to actually make your views clear. And we can all sit on the sidelines and carp at how rubbish everything is. But it's important that we do contribute, because if we don't contribute as a body of farmers, as tenants, we can't really sit back later and say, oh, well, they've done all the wrong things. And I can rest assured, you certainly know George and Lynette and the whole team at head office, lobby very strongly, and we do our level best to. But having a body of members contributing to these consultations is important. So please get involved. So just before we go on to funding, Janet, I would really like to ask this one because I think it's probably something that a lot of people have in mind. So this is from Stuart Kirkwood, who's a very, very eminent and very supportive long-term member and contributor and supporter of the TFA. And he asked, he said, I'm very troubled concerning the practice of rewilding and the impact that rewilding projects are having on the loss of land from the tenanted sector. Given that this is a substantial change of use of land, does DEFRA consider that it should be necessary to secure planning consent for such a substantial change of land use? Not only is agricultural land taken out of food production by rewilding and all the past costs, grants and work destroyed, but its rewilding state could have a serious adverse effect on neighbouring land and its agricultural use. And I think that probably very eloquently expresses quite a lot of concerns that a lot of people, not just in the tenanted sector, have about rewilding. So perhaps you could just answer that, Janet, if you could.
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a crack, although that is a massive question, obviously, about the kind of the whole shape of the countryside. So I probably can't do it full justice. And Stuart, I'm very happy to pick up with you afterwards if you'd like a longer conversation about it. I think the way that if we're supporting rewilding through environmental land management schemes, then it will be through the landscape recovery agreements, and those are bespoke long-term agreements, and people entering into them would have to get all of the right sort of consents and permits and do the statutory consultations, etc. We're still working out what the steps are that you'd have to go through in order to reach such an agreement, and that's why we're doing some initial agreements over the next couple of years just to learn how to do it before we then offer it up at scale. And this is the sort of issue that we'd have to get into as part of that, I think. So I recognise the concerns. I think if there were some rewilding proponents here, they'd probably have answers to them, but far be it from me to start trying to argue the case one way or the other as to whether rewilding is the right thing to do at any particular location. I think it really depends, doesn't it, on the location and what is connected to and what the environment is and who the neighbours are and all, what the existing land use is and whether it's productive or not, and all of those sorts of questions come into play, don't they, as to whether that particular piece of land is actually suitable for that type of treatment, and if so, what sort of permissions should go along with it. And that's what we just started a round of tests and trials on. We got about 70 applications for tests and trials looking in more depth at how the landscape recovery scheme should work, and I would have thought this is one of the sorts of issues we'd be getting into there.
Okay, thanks, Janet. I'm sure Stuart would welcome a longer discussion about rewilding, and I'll leave it to him to make contact with you.
Great, send me an email, Stuart, and we can have a chat. And I'll put you in touch with my team who are working on it.
I think one of the concerns that I certainly hear from my peers locally here, I think we're probably productive enough that people aren't going to rewild here, but it's not without a possibility. And I think one of the concerns we have is that at the start of this whole process, there was very much a focus on, I think, on sort of sustainability being both economic food production as well as environmental production. And I think one of the concerns, and rewilding perhaps is at the pinnacle of this, is that we're heading down a route of, a lot of environmental support, and sort of food production is potentially getting subcontracted to abroad. Now, I don't want you to answer that, Janet, because I know you won't agree with that. And I'm just paraphrasing where I think some of this goes to, but it is a real concern, I think, in certain areas. So I think I'd quite like to sort of focus the last 10 or 15 minutes on sort of funding issues. And I think I'll start perhaps with one that perhaps sums up a little bit, and then we'll just jot around. There's quite a lot on funding in various different ways, and I'll apologise already because we won't get around to asking all of these questions. But I'll just kick off with this, and perhaps you could take this one, Janet, as being a slightly broader question about how do we, as farmers in all sorts of different sectors, how are we going to be able to continue to get the same level of support that perhaps we've used to under BPS, and maybe we shouldn't be getting that level of support? That's another question that you might want to answer. But Robert Martin, who's our vice chairman, who farms over in Cumbria, says, how does a fully utilised lowland beef, sheep or dairy farm gain enough points for a scheme to replace the monies they've lost when the BPS is totally taken away? Or is the government happy to see such units just increase production to cover the shortfall and not jump through the hoops for a scheme? And when I say this is kind of a broader question, Janet, I think there's a lot of questions here about, in all sorts of farming systems, how do we get to a level of support under the new ELMS and SFI schemes that we've previously had under BPS? How would we go in that direction? And so maybe you could sort of broaden that answer, but I think Robert's question kind of focuses a little bit on the sort of more specific detail that you might want to look at.
Yeah, okay, so that's a big question. So there's a few elements to this. The first is to say that the money taken out of direct payments will go back into the sector, and there's been a commitment to the end of this parliament that that's what will happen. So the amount that's going in now is 2.4 billion in England, and that will continue until the end of this parliament. Obviously, the current government can't make a commitment beyond this parliament because they may not be the government at that stage. But I think any government that wants to achieve environment, climate and welfare outcomes on 70% of the land in the country you would expect want to continue that funding. So we think it's a reasonable planning assumption to make that there will be funding available beyond that point, but obviously it depends on who is elected, and everyone will exercise their vote and get that to happen. But for now, talking about this Parliament, it's the same amount of money going back in as comes out. Having said that, when you get money for being in a scheme, there's obviously a cost of being in that scheme that's not there when you get the money for BPS. So even if you get the same amount of cash back as you were getting in BPS, which you can do through the sustainable farming incentive relative to the losses that you make from BPS in those first couple of years, then if you go in at the highest levels of ambition, but the actual net income to you is not the same, because you have to do things. We want you to do some more things in order to be part of the sustainable farming incentive. And so the answer to the question about how you make up your lost income can't 100% be by participating in schemes. We think that has a big role to play in increasing your income, but there are also other ways for farmers to increase their income, and plenty of these won't be relevant to all, like none of these are relevant to everybody. But we think in lots of cases, there are basically 3 ways for farmers to make up their lost BPS income. One is to increase their income by either participating in these environment schemes or doing other things to increase your income, like shortening your supply chain where that's possible, like making your goods more marketable where that's possible for you. So the price, for example, of fat and protein content in milk can result in increased prices or quality of your produce, and other ways that you can increase your income, including diversification, although that is also not for everybody, I know. And we will help through that. You will help farmers to increase their income by providing, amongst other things, productivity support, innovation, research and development, investment, and also free resilience support, which is business planning advice, which will be available through 19 different organisations as from August. And there's some information on our blog about that if you'd like to find out about it. But it's professional advisors who can help you think through the options for your business. And also, let me say, I don't want to offend anybody, because I know farmers think all the time about these 3 things I'm outlining, but we also know from the evidence that in most cases, the most profitable farms will tend to be doing much more in respect of increasing their income, reducing their costs and reducing waste than the less profitable farms. And those less profitable farms are the ones that tend to be more reliant on basic payments. And so these things that I'm saying are things to consider. So increase your income, reduce your costs by lowering your inputs, by using either technology or practices that result in you not having such high input costs, particularly in relation to fertilizers and pesticides, and also other nutrient management. We know that half of farms don't have a nutrient management plan, whereas that is something that's associated with those who have a higher margin and a higher profit on their farm, and a third don't do soil measurements. And there might be very good reasons for that in each case, but we think probably more farms could do that to reduce their costs, just as an example. Breed selection, feed efficiency, also ways to reduce your costs, and we'll help with that through the animal health and welfare pathway, which we haven't talked about much this evening, but which is going to be helping to just increase animal health and welfare throughout the sector. Next year, in the sustainable farming incentive, that will come in the form of a free vet visit. Vet-led team will come to your farm and do tests and give you advice about how to increase animal health and welfare, and some of that will result in reduced costs. And we'll also help with that through productivity investment and innovation, research and development investment that can help with efficiency. So you're not reducing your production at all, you're just doing it more efficiently and therefore increasing your margin. And then finally, reducing waste. So you've got increasing your income, reducing costs, reducing waste. And the waste that I'm talking about is, for example, through pest and disease control. So things like liver fluke, which results in 250,000 rejected carcasses a year, or crops lost at harvest or in storage, or kind of endemic diseases. And some of those will be supporting through the animal health and welfare pathway, and also through the productivity investment that we'll be supporting, and also through our payment schemes, and also through better learning and development for farmers. So we're investing in an Institute for Agriculture and Horticulture to support continuous professional development for those who are interested in that too. So in terms of making up your lost income, the schemes will play a big part, because there's a lot of money going through those schemes, and all the money that comes out of direct payments will go into those schemes, whether it's environment or productivity. But there is also this wider picture, and that's why we're doing the investment we're doing in productivity, innovation, research, development, learning and development, and resilience advice. And for those who are fuming, saying, I already do all those things, what the hell are you talking about? I will post a link to the evidence pack that I'm referring to, which is where we published, somebody's asked a question about whether we've done an analysis of the likely impact on farms, and we have, and it's in this document here. And that sets out for you quite a detailed analysis of what makes the difference between the most profitable and the least profitable farms? What is it those most profitable ones are doing? And it's those things that I've just outlined. And we think that for lots of farms, there'll be just something in there that you can do that will help make up the lost income alongside taking part in schemes. So that's quite a long answer, but it's quite a sort of involved set of questions around making up lost income. And I'm happy to pick up the threads on any of that, Mark, if you want to pursue.
Thanks, Janet. That's really useful. You've actually answered a few of the other questions vertically as you've gone along, and thanks for posting that link because I think Michael Summers' question about that the expectation is that net funding won't change, and has a farm level analysis been completed to assess where the winners and losers will be? That document will clearly be useful. Yeah. What I would just like to point out, this is more an observation, Janet, rather than a question, because I think you've kind of answered this. But this is from a member over in the Lake District, Christine Grange, I think. And she comments, we were supposed to be on the SFI pilot, but having spent several hours studying the standards, the only one we can work with is improved grassland standard introductory level, which if we put all our pasture and meadowland in, will raise us £999 a year. Not even 10% of the BPS that we receive now. We are a small upland farm, cannot go up the level because it requires us to grow 10% scrub, which will put our wildlife, curlews, etc. at risk. And she asks, are there any more plans to support smaller, extremely important farms? The first bit of that, I think, is really for information, Janet, I guess. But it does, I think, represent quite clearly where a lot of people see the level of support being, which is considerably, well, not even really, touching the sides in terms of where we are with BPS. And I understand your thorough answer to the question before. So just take that as something to take back, maybe. But there is an important question. It's an important observation, obviously, but there is an important question at the end of that, is that are there any plans to support smaller, extremely important farms? And we've maybe come full circle there to Helen's initial comment about the uplands and commons and grazing schemes. So maybe you could just answer that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So the standards that are in the pilot, there are 8 standards that we're taking into the pilot. That's not the end of the story. That's our starting position in terms of the things that we want to do. There are also, obviously, alongside that, existing options in CS for this type of farm situation, and we're expecting to develop standards that will encompass a lot of those actions going forward. So the things like the wildlife offer and the upland offer, one way or another, we will expect to see the actions that are in there reflected in the sustainable farming incentive in due course. I don't know, it's hard to tell from the question whether you can't work with it because of payment rates or because of the nature of the standards. I'd be interested to know, if you want to get in touch with me, Christine, afterwards, I'd love to know a little bit more about what's going on here and why it is that the rest of the standards don't work for you. And because it might be the whole point of the pilot is to test things, and if it's a kind of particular aspect that we can just adjust to make it work for you, then I really want to know about that and know what that is. So please do get in touch and let us know. There are more standards coming, and in the document that we published in June, we set out what some of them are that are under active consideration that may be more attractive in this sort of situation, and they include agroforestry. I've seen that applied in an upland setting quite creatively and in an interesting way. Hedgerows, obviously very relevant. Dry stone walls, farm woodland, unimproved, low and no input grassland, which you may have some of if I'm understanding correctly your description of where you are. Heritage standards. We're also looking at orchards and permanent crops and peaty soils. So there's a range of, I mean, obviously I don't know your particular farm setting, so I don't know which ones of those are relevant, more or less relevant to you. But that's just to give you a sense of the kind of broader range of standards that are coming. And the idea is that by the time we get to 2024, there really is something for everybody in here. And if you're in countryside stewardship already, you'll be able to transfer across, and if you're not, you'll be able to come in through sustainable farming incentive, and there will be things there. Some of the issues that we're looking at alongside developing these standards are how do the standards work in a mixed farm setting and a small farm setting. And we've had some feedback about, for example, the requirements about margins when the fields are very small, and how might we adjust those. And so we are looking quite actively at some of those questions about how do we make sure these things work for small farms. So Christine, if you do please keep in touch with the team about what you're learning by looking at these standards and why you think they don't work for you, and tell us, and we can see what we can do about it.
Okay, thanks, Janet. I am quite conscious of time here, and I'm always conscious with these that there's a certain level of concentration span that we all have. But I'm just going to ask one question, which is, well, it's kind of two really. There was a specific question sent in earlier from Sam Hoates, who's in Lancaster. Sorry, living near Yorkshire, it's difficult to say that. So he's asking specifically about whether ELMS requires farmers to score a certain number of points to be valid for a scheme, because he wants to do some environmental work but doesn't want to be excluded from ELMS. And on a slightly broader scheme, and I do hear this, and there's a number of questions on the Q&A about this, is how are you going to ensure that those people that are already doing the right thing, so you've mentioned things like manure management plans and whatever, many people will have been doing that for years and years and will wonder why they weren't getting paid to do that now, and why it's only going to be paid. I mean, obviously they can get payment for doing it now, but will they still have access to the funding, and how will you reward those people that are already doing the right thing? So I don't know if you could just cover that, Janet, and then I think we might have to draw it to an end and email you a mass of other questions.
You're welcome to email with the questions afterwards. I'm always happy to answer questions, and in particular when they're emailed to me, get my team to do so, which is happy to volunteer them to do that work. And they'll be happy to do it because we love to engage with farmers. So in terms of existing work, this is really important. We're not just here to invest in new hedges or new assets. And that's part of the reason why the Sustainable Farming Incentive has been designed in a way that's based on what assets you have on your farm and how you look after them, rather than like put this thing in here. So there will be capital investment to support new things, like, for example, putting in place agroforestry. But if you've already got it in place, then we'll pay you to maintain it. So we've got a balance of investing in new things and also maintaining things that you're already doing, whether that's practices or assets. And if you are already doing lots of the things in the standards, it's likely you'll be able to come in at a higher level of ambition and get paid more, because you'll already have well-established mature practices and you'll know what you're doing and you'll be able to operate at that sort of level, whereas those coming for the first time perhaps might be more pitching for the lowest level of ambition and therefore a lower payment. So the principle is certainly you should be rewarded. You shouldn't lose out because you've already done something. That's a completely perverse incentive, and we should pay you to maintain that thing, whether it's a practice or an asset. And if you see something in our standards as we publish them that you think doesn't meet that, then let us know, because that is very much the intent behind what we're doing.
Okay, thanks, Janet. That's really good to hear, because I think that is such an important thing, that you don't lose what people have been doing already by virtue of the fact that you've kind of disengaged them because they don't think they're getting rewarded for what they've already done. I think that that over the last, I don't know how long we've had environmental schemes. It seems to go back to sort of set-aside days in the 90s. There's probably lots of people, you guys probably aren't old enough to remember that kind of stuff, but I do. And there'll be a lot of people who do. So you're 30 odd years in, and some of that land will have been in these schemes in one shape or form for the last 30 odd years, and presumably doing a lot of good. Yeah. So it'll be a real shame to start to lose that. Thanks very much for that. Lynette, did you want to just add anything before we wind up?
No, just a general kind of plug, I suppose, to TFA members and non-members. If you have any questions on the agricultural transition plan or future farming programs, please just call and ask us and raise any concerns you have. That's why we're here as your membership organisation. We engage. I spend a lot of my time engaging with Janet and her team, and so if anybody does have any concerns, I really am all ears, as Janet is, to listening to those queries and questions. Also, for anybody in the Sustainable Farming Incentive Pilot, we are running a small focus group of tenant farmers. So again, if anybody's missed that and would like to take part, please get in touch.
Thanks, Lynette. Thanks for that. Just first of all, a huge thanks to Janet for coming on tonight. It's never easy on these occasions to be getting grilled, and thank you for your honesty and your openness with the questions. And unfortunately, they won't stop, and you know that, and you're very good.
That's fine.
People. So yeah, don't be away camping too long. I'm very
just a couple of weeks.
Yeah. I'm very pleased to hear that you pass lots of these questions onto your team. I've got a vested interest in my daughter starting work at DEFRA in September, so I'm expecting to have A, a huge inside track, and B, for her to be worked very hard, as she needs to be. But it's really good. And on a much more serious note, I think it's really important for members, and I know we don't all have the time to do this, but it's important to, if you do have the time, to just pass on your views, both to DEFRA and through Lynette, George, myself, and any other members of the team, because we can only represent you and feed stuff into DEFRA if we know what you're thinking. And it's great that you've come on tonight and contributed. And massive apologies for not getting around to. I think we've probably done about 10% of the questions, in fairness. So apologies to those people who didn't have your questions answered, but we will do a roundup of those and post them, I think, on the website probably. So thank you very much, Janet, for coming this evening. Thank you also to Lynette for coming and giving a sort of TFA response on that. Much appreciated. A huge thank you once again to Barclays who have been sponsoring these webinar events. We do, as ever, rely on sponsors, and Barclays are a big supporter of the TFA, so we very much thank them for supporting this once again. A quick reminder that this was recorded, so if you didn't follow Janet's thorough answers as she was saying them, go back and have another look on the YouTube channel, the news area of the TFA website. We will be retaining some virtual events post-harvest, so I don't think we've got anything in August, or if we have, I'm certainly not chairing it, so we haven't got anything in August, but we will be back after harvest, and we're running these through the autumn and a winter again, so please look out for when they are. And again, if you want particular questions to be addressed, then please fire them into Julia or Lynette or myself or George, and we'll endeavour to put a panel of people together to answer the specific queries. So again, apologies for running over time. I think it was inevitable given the subject we were talking about, but thanks very much for all who attended. I hope it's been a useful evening. I know we haven't answered all the questions, but we hopefully have put some food for thought and moved things on a little bit in your head. So thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you again after harvest. And let's hope we all have a nice harvest. We could do with a better one than last year, that's for sure.
Thanks very much again.
And we look forward to seeing everybody soon.
Thanks, everyone.